Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to 1% Better, a podcast where we take a look at hidden stories in sport. I'm your host, Dr. David Littman, of course not joined today by Zylan Fanake, my co-host. What we are doing, as you all probably know, is we're doing a series called the Energy Series with Aitor Viribay, who's kindly joined us for a number of them. And we've decided to release them midweek as standalones. So here is your second in the lot. Of course, the first one that we did was about building a performance environment. It was audio only while Zylan was away late last year. So do go back and check that one out. That is the first and sets everything up for this series. Then, as we get to this episode, this is all about energy expenditure. So thinking about where we're spending energy, how we're spending it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These two are the foundations on which we'll build the rest of the series on. So these two are good. This is a really important podcast for all people, not just athletes, because we all just deal in energy. That's really what this boils down to, is how are we spending our energy? Now, you can think about that from a caloric standpoint, or you could think about it from an emotional energy, mental energy, those sort of things. But all of the above is to say, this is what this episode is about. Aitor was very gracious with his time. So before we get to Aitor and energy expenditure, I did want to thank Precision Fuel and Hydration, who have been sponsoring us since day one. Really appreciate them. They obviously make all sorts of things, carbohydrates, they make electrolytes, etc., fueling products. And so we've been using them personally for a long time, in races, in training, etc. They've obviously released, we talked about recently, their watermelon gel, which is something we haven't yet tried, but we are very keen to try, and we will be doing soon. So do go check out Precision Fuel and Hydration. We do have a discount code for you that is BETTER, all in capital letters, 2026. And we do have in our show notes a link to their fueling and hydration planner, which will automatically apply that discount code to your order once you've done your ordering from there, if you want to do that. The Fuel and Hydration Planner is just about planning race nutrition. So you can do that obligation free. You can also book a call with their sports scientists to talk to them about that as well. Again, obligation free, but that is there. Do follow our show notes to let them know you've come from us. That discount is 15% on your first order. So good to go do that. Now, that is all about energy, of course. Fueling is part of the energy equation. The other one is better understanding the energy required. And now Stride doesn't do that per se, but it does give you an idea of effort. So I've been using Stride running power meters for a long time, which is probably just over 2 years now. And you can get all sorts of metrics from them that I find to be quite interesting. I've recently talked on a podcast about leg spring stiffness. So that is basically about how your legs are responding like springs. And, with my Achilles injury, getting more springy is something that has been really important to me. So it's been a good way for me to track how that's been going and that progression. So do go check out Stride. You can use one as more of a pacing tool, etc., understanding some of your metrics. If you start to use two, you can start to understand asymmetries between the left and right there. So we've had quite a few discussions on this in our Strava group as well. So do go check out Stride. And thanks to both Stride and Precision for sponsoring the podcast. Without further ado, let's get to Aitor and talk about energy expenditure. So, Aitor, welcome back to 1% Better podcast. I'm not going to do a big intro for you. For those listeners who haven't listened to the first episode with you in our series, energy series as we're calling it, the first one was on building a performance culture. I'd encourage people to go back and listen to that, because I think there's a lot there that is going to be built on. That was kind of the foundational episode, and we'll build from there on the next thing and the next thing. And of course, not everybody is involved in elite sport or that interested in elite sport, but I think the lessons to take away from that first episode certainly have application to recreational athletes and anybody who's looking to perform in general. It doesn't even have to be athletically. It might be at work or something like this. So I wanted to preface that with this. And we are calling this the Energy Series because, when we were discussing and planning all this, it kind of all comes back to energy to a degree. It's like that's where we sort of landed, you and I. So let's start there. Like, how do we quantify energy expenditure, or how would you quantify energy expenditure?
Well, hi again, David. Thank you for having me again here.
Of course.
Yeah, of course. I think, and that's probably, I'm going through that transformation on myself as well as a practitioner, scientist of understanding the body as, through energy. And that's probably the most biological principle that you can understand the human body. I don't know, there are plenty of definitions of a human being, of course, but I like this approach that we can define ourselves as a materia where energy goes through, and that's life. And when you don't flow that energy, then you die. And we're just that, a block of energy that is coming in and out. And we, I'm very skeptical as well on this concept that we have always learned, which is you burn energy or you spend energy. And if you look into the physical and biological sense, you really transform energy. That's what we do. We transform energy. And I'm pretty, as I don't know if I told you this in the first episode, but I first studied studying engineering, civil engineering, just to make bridges and roads
Yep.
and all that.
Yeah, yeah.
I've got this background of understanding physics as well, and yeah, bringing down to an energetical point of view of the human conditions that might be health, disease, and of course performance. I think you can upgrade your vision into another level. So yeah, of course, if we want to consider ourselves as kind of uh, constant relationship with the energy through our lifespan, of course, my opinion, I think we need to understand how we can measure it. If you cannot measure your main kind of dimension, then probably you're missing almost everything. And that's where I've been the last probably 7-8 years of my career, just focused on understanding this concept, and then recently in the last 4 or 5 years, specializing myself into measuring it. And measuring energy expenditure is extremely difficult, and in some cases I could say impossible because we are so dynamic. We change. I mean, we have so many factors affecting the way we transfer energy. I'm not gonna talk anymore about spending or burning or transforming energy. That it makes it a very difficult task. But what we know is that of course there are different techniques to measure that energy, and we have been experiencing with one of the most accurate one, which is the Doubly labeled water, which is just a methodology to measure it. Not necessarily the gold standard, because probably the gold standard might be a metabolic chamber where you basically spend a day, a week, 3 days, or whatever, a certain period of time there, and you're completely monitored. Like you are in a room like this one, and basically you can every second, every minute, all the kind of machines behind that room, they can track how much you are transforming. But doubly labeled water is probably the most reliable, the most accurate methodology to compare to that kind of metabolic lab condition testing in the real world, and that's what we have been experiencing recently in the field, and we have seen that this technique, which is a pretty old one, it has more than 50 years if I'm not wrong. It can serve as a very accurate and very useful tool to understand how human beings, and especially my field, which is high elite endurance athletes, how they spend energy, and we have been learning too much recently. I think that we can still don't understand properly. We still need to digest all that, and but I've been always very empirical, and my way of understanding the human performance, and now translated that into health and disease is it is completely changing, simply because what we are seeing, and that's pretty cool. It's pretty interesting to see how by measuring new things, or figuring out that those numbers that we're studying are not necessarily the same, or not as accurate as we thought. We are opening a new kind of a window into the knowledge, and that's where we are.
Yeah, I think maybe it's because everybody is coming to the conclusion, but it's certainly something I've come to as well. Other people might be influencing me. I'd say more than me spending a lot of time thinking. It's probably more other people influencing me. But once you start to examine things through the lens of energy, it all starts to make some sense. And if you think about it, uh, in terms of empirical and ancient wisdom, so to speak, like if you start to look at traditional Chinese medicine and understanding, they talk about qi, which is just energy, right?
Yeah,
So you start to think like all these roads start to converge into one thing, which is, hey, maybe it is just about energy. So just for some listeners, in a metabolic chamber, you're basically measuring gases, from my understanding, right? It's really looking at gas exchange, because that gives us a good idea. And with respect to doubly labeled water, it's been a while since I've looked this up, but you're labeling both the hydrogen, it's the carbon and the oxygen, aren't you?
no,
The
the hydrogen
hydrogen
and
and the
oxygen.
oxygen,
Yeah.
sorry, because then you start to see the excretion of the. Oh, you'd have to go through. My physiology's cooked here.
Both of them. Yeah, yeah. No, I
Yeah,
can
yeah,
explain it very.
yeah.
It is
Please
very
do.
easy. At the end of the day, you're drinking a heavy water,
Yep.
and water is hydrogen and oxygen. So
Yep.
basically, you mark those two isotopes. So
Yep.
basically, you're using a heavy hydrogen, which is called the deuterium, and you're using another heavy oxygen. And
Yep.
basically, you are just tracking how those two isotopes they are getting diluted across the body. Why? Because hydrogen goes or you excrete hydrogen on your liquids. So that might be
Yep.
urine, sweat,
Yep.
water, respiration. And the oxygen goes with the CO2. So that is an outcome or a consequence of transforming energy in our body. So
Yep.
basically, you just drink a heavy water that is labeled on those two isotopes, and then you track how they disappear across the body, and then you estimate no, through the body, sorry, across a certain period of time, and then you estimate how much calories you're converting. So it's just another technique, as you say, but it's has been validated. It is very very accurate, and we can even explore if you want maybe different techniques to measure that and etc. But it is a different methodology to basically measuring your gas exchange, which is as well. We normally, I mean, the dynamic is very, you know this very well. You uptake oxygen and you transform that, or you use that oxygen to transform, chemical energy that is in the food into biological energy, and then you produce CO2. So that's essentially what we are tracking and measuring constantly on a metabolic chamber or a metabolic device.
Yeah, and my bias as somebody who's less scientist and more practitioner is always field measures. So I'm biased towards doubly labeled water. I just think that in a mixture of things like the Hawthorne effect, having to sit in a room, boredom, all those things, like I just think that it's very clinically and experimentally valid, but perhaps not as empirically valid or valid in the field. Whereas I'm always biased that way, and that's why I work with wearables and do all those things. So I'm biased to the field measures, and we're starting to. The thing that excites me most is that coaches are starting to measure this in athletes, right? We had Olav Alexander Boo release the article with Christian Blumenfeld. We had Kylian Jornet release an article about his Western States. We've had certainly things from the elite cycling world, which is a world you've been into. So it's cool to start to see some of the outliers, because I think the extremes can inform the means to some degree as well. So
Absolutely, yeah, and that's the is coming back to your initial point. That's the utility or the good thing, the practicality of this methodology is that you can bring kind of lab validity or accuracy, lab grade accuracy into the field, and that's where this technology has been extremely difficult to replicate simply because it has been very expensive. You could only just access to it through university projects, etc. And some of the data that we know nowadays, they are basically collaborations between athletes and universities. But now that is slowly becoming more kind of a service. Like private companies, they are bringing this into the market, and that's where probably a new possibilities of measuring the human energy transformation is becoming a reality. And that's where I'm very proud and happy to say that I introduced this technique to Kilian, and thanks to that he started measuring this, and that we can now access very nice data. Like he's an absolutely outlier and an extreme of the maximum capacities of the human transformation in the body, in the human body. And that's I think that is as if I remember back when I started studying, we were used to study Miguel Indurain's physiological profile as a
yep,
reference of that, and we were talking about VO2 max and heart rate and lactate, and now it's probably the same process. We're gonna need to start kind of feeding that database of energy expenditure measured by the real, real measurements or real validated techniques. And Killian, of course, what Olaf has done with the Norwegian triathletes is fantastic work there on documentation, and all that is gonna get, in my humble opinion, is gonna get more frequent, and we're gonna get more data more often, because this is gonna be a real marker of the human performance.
yeah, I think like many things, right? It's the F1 model. This technology trickles down and becomes more available, be it a wearable. But like I started running before GPS watches were around. Now that you wouldn't, there's almost nobody that doesn't run with a GPS watch now. Even like the 5K park runners are using a GPS watch, and they're so affordable, comparative, right? Whereas we'll get there eventually, right? There are now companies offering personalized carbohydrate oxidation testing, all those things. It's all going to be commodified and come down because people are so interested in performance and physiology. So I do think that. But let's double click there. Let's talk about some doubly labeled water insights we gained. For you and I, how would we quantify energy expenditure? And then what's the sort of normal rate for us? And then what are we starting to see from people like Killian and the Norwegians?
Yeah. Well, so we quantify energy expenditure through this technique, normally in kilocalories per day. So that's kind of the standard unit that we use. And the reason behind that is that, of course, doubly level water is a very, you know, it's a very good technique, but also it has limitations. And you cannot measure, the periods of measuring with this technique are quite long. If you consider what exercises, you cannot measure 1 hour or 2 hours or 30 minutes. This is normally something that we measure on a a period of time of days, 3 days, 5 days, 7 days, and there are limitations on that as well. And there's some studies showing how you can, of course, refine that technique and maybe shorten and alleviate that period into not one, but yeah, 1 to 3 days, for example. So this is something that it measures the total daily energy expenditure. So this is not about measuring only how much energy you are using or transforming into your exercise right now, that you go running and you get back and you know exactly that amount. It's about your total daily energy expenditure. And that is a cool thing because that informs not only what you're spending during the exercise, but how much energy you need to recover from that exercise, to deal with your daily routine or your daily habits, to go with whatever you are going through at that moment, whether that's a stress or injury or whatever. So it considers the whole kind of cake of the day. Okay. So that's where normally that's the unit is kilocalories per day. And of course, what we are seeing is that they're it is very individual, and it's very different the way that amount that we are tracking on different athletes on different conditions. And the good thing is that not only that energy expenditure, that energy transformation comes from the same, and that's the good thing about this technique, that we are measuring the daily energy expenditure. And sometimes that might be the expenditure that you are showing on training, or in some other cases that might be that you're simply not training, but you are too stressed that your energy expenditure is at the roof, simply because you are using a lot of resources to go over that, whatever stress, immunity crash, or whatever it is. So it is pretty interesting, and it is opening a new kind of way of understanding the human behaviors, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's. I think the acquisition frequency, as you said, could be seen as what some people might say is a bug, but I think to your point, it's a feature as we start to understand a more holistic picture in a day, and I think we can get certainly the way things are going at the moment in sports nutrition. There's lots of concerns around energy availability, and one of the questions I've had, and we, I had I'm blanking on his name now. This is horrible, but Jose Areta was on the podcast, and we talked a
Yeah.
bit about energy deficits and what that might do there. And his viewpoint is that they're not as bad potentially in a short term as we might think, and whatever else. But one of the questions I've always had for people and researchers was, over what duration is energy deficit a problem? Right, because no one thinks you can match energy within a day, and it's probably not a problem over a couple of days. But we start to look at weeks and months, and it becomes a problem. But we don't have a hard line for that. And so I do think this. I say all that to say that when we come to energy, it doesn't make a lot of sense to be measuring in minutes and hours. Maybe it makes sense to measure an exercise session because you're trying to understand that dosing. But other than an exercise session, it makes no sense to me to measure anything other than a day or a week or something like that to really understand things, because the way we are, we're made to be in periods of deficit and surplus. Like that's kind of that cycle is the way that humans are evolved and designed, so to speak. So, but let's talk about values. My understanding with this is, whilst we measure kilocalories, we tend to normalize to multiples of basal metabolic rate. Is that
Yeah,
generally the standard?
correct, and that's what we call the PAL factor. So basically, how many times you are over exceeding your basal metabolic rate. You know
Yeah,
what basal metabolic rate means? Your energy expenditure for the kind of minimum functioning of your body.
yeah,
So if you're going to stay a whole day just laying out on your bed and all those functions that are absolutely vital for your to keep you alive. That's the basal metabolic rate, and we normally normalize. We tend to normalize or use this unit of the total daily energy expenditure. That number might be whatever 10,000 kilocalories per day, normalized to your basal metabolic rate. So if your basal metabolic rate might be whatever 1,000, just to make it super
yep,
around, that PAL factor might be 10. So
yep,
you could have a PAL factor of 10, and that represents 10 times your basal metabolic rate. And that's the unit that we are using right now to track exactly how much an athlete can spend energy and for how long. Because I think probably on a different questions that we're going to go through right now, we're going to explore the capacity to spend energy. That's something that is not unlimited. It is limited. Otherwise, we could run forever without getting tired. But we all have a certain finite energy resources over a day, over a week, over a month, years, and of course over our whole lifespan. So it is about managing and allocating that energy properly so we can optimize it. And that's exactly what you said. You can measure, and I have always found it very interesting, of course, measuring your energy expenditure during the exercise, because that is a marker of your efficiency of how much energy you are spending, but not as a way to understand how you spend energy in the whole day, because there are other 22 hours, 20 hours on the day that you have no clue about them. So measuring only that kind of exercise, it might be a little bit reduction of the whole thing. And now that we can measure the daily energy transformation, which is our daily energy budget, then we are learning that energy expenditure, and of course related to your energy deficit or even adaptation, or how we kind of stretch our limits to get adapted, or how we save some energy to recover properly. So that kind of flowing around the limits of the energy expenditure, that's what we are learning. And I think that is going to impact massively on the way we train, the way we manage nutrition, the way we rest as well. And that is the cool thing that a new window of possibilities are opening in front of us.
yeah. And just to, I guess, take a step back for some listeners who may not be as scientifically minded, you kind of, in terms of energy expenditure in a day, we have basal metabolic rate, and if you read the textbooks, they'll say, yeah, that'll be somewhere around 60 to 70% for most people, I think they say, and that'll be a little bit lower in an elite athlete because they're expending so much training energy, so to speak. Then you have, physical activity basically, and that can be, exercise or just general movement around. And then you'll have the thermic effect of food. So the energy, thermic effect of food, which is the component that it requires you to digest food, which is kind of counterintuitive until you think, oh, actually, yeah, I do have to get this in, but it does cost you some energy.
Yeah, sorry. That depends probably on the model. Some of the models they take the basal metabolic rate as your basal conditions, and then they add the need, the
Yeah,
non-exercise activity,
activity.
and that's where
Yeah,
it goes. If you are doing more steps, if you're just doing more little tasks like whatever, cleaning the house or or cooking, whatever. Of course, that requires a higher energy expenditure than just being sat down or lay down in
yeah,
the bed. No? Yeah.
for sure. And the way I explain basal metabolic rate to people is it's the energy it requires for you to exist. Like it
Exactly.
just doing nothing, existing, not thinking, not like none of that stuff, just like existing. So it's quite hard to measure that well because yeah, you're always kind of doing something, and it's so it's a little bit difficult. But a lot of people will go get their basal metabolic rate tested in a gym or something like this. I go to my personal trainer and he like makes me lie down, and it's an idea of resting metabolic rate, not basal metabolic rate, I would say, because basal is truly basal. You would have been at home, and maybe it's the 10 minutes before you wake up. We get an idea of what that is. So I digress, but why that's important is because everybody's basal metabolic rate is different, right? And therefore, similarly, their energy expenditure and ability to absorb energy and all that stuff is different. But what seems to be relatively consistent, and you know this better than I do, and I'm happy for you to talk to this, is our ability to expend multiples of that seems to be relatively consistent. So whilst the ultimate values seem to differ, right? You may be able to do 10,000, I might be able to do 5,000. Our relative values, as reference to our basal metabolic rate, seems to be relatively consistent across humans.
Exactly, and that's a good thing that we can normalize, and we can make them relative to the human the human being in general, whether if you're an athlete, or if you're a normal person, or if you have a metabolic syndrome as well. And that's
Yep.
where the current scientific literature, probably I'm sure you have read of
Yeah.
about that, is that this asymptote that we cannot spend energy. This for example, in cycling, we use very often this power duration curve, and
Yep.
of course, as long as the duration gets longer, your power has this kind of a pattern that it goes asymptote. I think that's the right word in English.
Yep.
That it gets normalizing into a certain kind of line that is the infinite.
Yeah.
That happens exactly the same with the energy expenditure. So we all have, or the human being as a species, we've got kind of capacities to spend a lot of energy in 1 day, 3 days, 2 days, 5 days, and that goes slowly, coming down as long as you elongate that time or that duration. And the current scientific literature, and big references for me, like Hermann Poncher, etc. These big authors that they have been that they have been exploring and are working with this technique for a long time. They published different data showing that there might be a limit of human energy expenditure at around 2.5 times your basal metabolic rate that you can spend consistently over a year, for example. So that means that you cannot exceed, well, in theory, the human being cannot exceed 2.5 times its the basal metabolic rate. So guessing or deducting that we've got a limit there on how much energy expenditure we can assume for a given time, that is a year, for example. The good thing is that we are now, because we are measuring more samples, and especially those who spend energy or transform energy in the best way, which are endurance athletes, and that's because energy transformation is a direct measurement of mitochondrial function. So essentially, you can transform more energy if you are more fit metabolically, or your mitochondrial works better than the second one that is behind you. We are measuring slightly different numbers to what the scientific literature says, and that's a pretty interesting thing, because of course, I can only talk a little. I had a little. Sorry, this is more like a personal anecdote, but
No, no,
I had a
please.
little. I had one of my, I don't know, one episode with John Spigman on Twitter. John Spigman is one of the best in this field as well. Someone who has been not only researching, but exploring the kind of the borders of measuring energy expenditure. And he replied to one of my tweets saying, and actually I've got it here printed in my, that's
I
that's a
love
good
this.
reminder, and a
Yeah.
daily good reminder, that he said the problem here is that all your data is unpublished. Nobody can see it and nobody can check it. You can say whatever you want, and that's absolutely right. I mean, we are measuring data that unfortunately we cannot publish, or personally, I am pretty small, so I don't have the capacity to publish it. But
Mm.
the reality is that we are now, because we have access to this pool of high elite athletes, we are measuring things that are slightly different to what the science says. And of course, we can see that athletes and the best endurance athletes in the world, they probably are above those numbers. They can spend energy consistently in a higher kind of a rate than only 2.5 times their basal metabolic rate. We are exploring that. We are seeing that probably the human limits are somewhere there. And actually, this paper that was published by Olaf and the triathletes, they also explore that, and they also kind of discuss around that idea, and we are now realizing that that is possible. But the good thing here is that, as you've got your power curve, and that's something that we can track on the last 90 days, 30 days, whatever, just analyzing a lot of data. This technique is allowing us to map out what the curve is on different athletes. So let's say my curve, that I'm just just an amateur, and I'm just training 5 hours or 7 hours or whatever it is per week, might be a certain curve that is limited compared to Kilian Jornet's curve. Why? Because his mitochondrial function, his metabolic function is so big that he can transform much more energy than me without collapsing. Okay, and that's the whole point. You can transform energy right now if you start. David Lehman, yourself, you can start right now running 30 hours per week. You can do it. Of course, you can. The problem is what impact that is going to have on your body, and that's the good thing. That meaning that you can doesn't mean that that's the right thing for you. So some people, they can afford it, and some others, like me, or like probably yourself, David. I don't know you. I mean, I'm not.
I can't afford it at the moment. I'll tell you that.
Yeah, I'm not under assessing yourself, but or under evaluating yourself. But you cannot simply afford 30 hours of running per week, because you're going to collapse. You're going to have injuries. You're going to have energy deficits. You're going to have whatever cortisol or immune system is going to get compromised, etc. So essentially, what we're measuring with this is that curve where you can navigate through across different durations safely, and that's where it comes this concept of energy budget, and this idea of this might be the kind of the ultimate internal load biomarker, because at the end of the day, you're just measuring, or you're tracking, monitoring your energy expenditure, or your energy transformation based on your own capacities.
Yeah. So I want to get back to a couple of things here. No, because what you said, there's so much stuff in there that we need to sort of pull on, and it is great. Like,
Yeah.
I love that you keep that on your desk, that picture. But unfortunately, and scientists get frustrated by this a lot, but the reality is that elite performance is ahead of science. It just is.
Hmm.
As we've got more precision in the field, we're unlocking it, right? So previously, scientists were the gatekeepers to doubly labeled water. They are no longer. Now, people like you or somebody else who's working with an elite cycling team, or Olav with the Norwegians, they have data. Right now, they get to choose whether to publish it or not, and it's a performance advantage to not publish it. Because if Olav
Yeah.
publishes that, now Lionel Sanders can go look at that and learn from it, right? So it's the fact that anybody is publishing data, it should be seen as a good thing, right? Because it's really hard to get that sort of it's a performance thing. So I would say that's the starting point. But it's there's also an interesting question here of whether these athletes are different to start with, or whether it's training or both. And I think everybody's gut is it's probably a bit of both. Maybe with a bigger contribution of training than we'd all like to believe, because we'd all like to believe that they're different and therefore we can't be elite. But I think
Mhm.
training is a big component of it. Um, but I also want people to understand here, these limits are timed, as you say, with the power duration curve, these are duration dependent. So I might be able to do 2.5 times for a week or a month, but I might not be able to do it for 2 months, right? 2 times basal metabolic rate. And you might be able to do it for 3 months, but not 4 months, right? Whatever that curve is, and where you cross the, I guess, let's call it unsustainable factor, is
Exactly.
different. But then we need to, when you're talking about energy budget, we may say, listen, Dave, you need to do a 30-hour training week, and that's going to be 2.7 times your energy budget, which you can sustain for, let's call it 10 days, but not 11 days. We're going to do a week of it, but then to bring you back into balance, because we need to push you again, we're actually going to have a period where you do less than that, right? So this is a classic sort of fatigue recovery, or dose response, these sort of things you'll see, fitness fatigue, all these sort of curves you'll see in different software. Like, this is what this is based on. Right now they use it as training
Exactly.
impulse, but fundamentally training impulse may, as you say, the ultimate measure, we talk about internal loads being things like heart rates or lactates, they may just be energy. It might just be energy turnover.
Okay. Yeah,
And
and
so,
that's the difference. Sorry,
no,
David, but
no.
just a little note there. We normally not only monitor, but also we prescribe training load based on external markers.
Yep.
We always prescribe training based on hours, kilometers, whatever, TSS, kilojoules, but
Yep.
we never prescribe that from an internal load perspective or point of view. And that's where exactly what you said. I mean, and this is probably not possible now because you have to, not yet, because we need to democratize and we still need to learn a lot about these concepts. But as an idea, as a hypothesis, if you want to call it that way, it is very, very strong because you can really map out the 52 weeks of a year depending on your PAL factor. You can really prescribe training based on how much energy you're going to be expending according to how much you can afford. And exactly as you say, and just to wrap up this point, you might say, I'm going to do 4 weeks, exceeding my limit, because that exceed is going to represent adaptation, and I'm going to push my body. But then I'm going to plan another 2 or 3 weeks below my limit so I can really, recover from that and get resources to the body. And that's what we do with hours and with kilometers. And that's the whole planification around training. You push the body and then you recover and then hopefully you adapt from it. So this is a way of understanding this process, this kind of a pushing and a releasing, I don't know how you call that in English, from the internal load perspective.
Yeah, I think increasingly, I think coaches are starting to prescribe by internal loads, but I think it's a course tool. It's heart rates or it's lactates. It's not
Mhm.
necessarily energy expenditures, and I think that's better than not in phases of the season. But yeah, it's not, the precision probably isn't there, right? There are many confounding variables that may maybe signal, maybe noise. But let's talk about some extreme situations here. So the theory is 2.5 times the basal metabolic rate seems to be, that's the PAL factor with which we seem to have problems going above for extended
Mhm.
periods. But we've seen papers, and I know that you have a bunch of data that you can't necessarily share because again, it's from an elite cycling team, and we can't necessarily share that because it's they own it fundamentally, and the riders own it. But what have we seen in the literature seems to be, or extreme situations that have been reported, so people can get an idea of scale here. I know Killian recently released data from Western States. Like, what are we seeing there from a PAL factor standpoint?
Well, so that's exactly as you. I think we can even talk about data, even if it's not, published. But of course, we will always have John Spiegman saying that we can say whatever we want, and he's going to be right. And I mean, I totally agree. I am a scientist, and I could love to publish everything, but sometimes you are limited by your environment. I wish I could, but yeah, just going to the point. We are seeing, it all depends on the durations, but we have, for example, explored. We can have some data on Killian Western States. That's how I think 15 hours race,
Yep.
or 14 something, and it's published, and he has spent, a huge amount of energy that might be 10 times PAL. I don't remember exactly the name, but that's around. It can be around that number. But then Killian himself, he made it public, the amount of energy that he spent on
States of elevation. Yeah.
exactly. So that big project that he stayed a whole month, if I'm not wrong, is doing huge amount of activity daily, so 15 to 17 hours of activity, and he was exceeding a PAL of 5. I think it was 5.5 PAL.
Wow.
In the middle there, we've got, for example, Ryan Sands racing at Cocodona. Cocodona is
200
250
miles.
miler,
Yeah.
and yeah, and he spent, I think he did like 62 hours or 61 hours, and he was very close to spend a PAL of 8 times his basal metabolic rate. So you see clearly how this is a time kind of
Yep.
related concept. And then we can go into the extreme, how a professional bike rider, how much energy they spend, or he spends on a 6 months preparation. So leading into the Tour de France or the Giro d'Italia, starting from, let's say, January to July, and of course you see that exceed 3.5 or very close to 4 of PAL, a PAL of 4. Of course, if you extend that into a full year, and the data that we can have, it probably sits around 2.53 of PAL for a whole year of training, average on a professional bike rider. So, I mean, this data is impressive, simply because we don't have it. All the data that is, we don't have it, let's say, published and available to the public. I mean, I'm just saying something that, of course, is based on averages, etc. But it's just potentially you can understand them as a trend or whatever. But what is published is just some data of some elite athletes, which is great. Some people that they have been part of a case study, for example, or that have been contributing with their data to science. But all that data is very, very limited. So even this concept, even this important paper on Ponce and et al., they use this asymptote. They talk about this concept, but that is based on a very limited data, of course. And
Yeah.
what we have nowadays is that we are feeding that database with more and more high elite endurance athletes, and that is giving us a very valuable and very good knowledge.
Ironically, if we regress back to some more basic scientific concepts, we would say that looking at elites, the elite data shouldn't influence recreationals, and recreational data shouldn't be applied to elites, right? I think all of those people would agree with that, and yet they would also say that there is a level of evidence that is expert practitioner level, right? Now that is a low level of evidence, but ironically, because it isn't published, they're getting a bit stroppy about it because it serves their argument. And I'm saying this, not you, but that's how I see this in the situation. But I certainly, when I saw the paper on Christian Blumenfeld from Olav Alexander Boo and sent it to people, it wasn't just you that I sent it to a number of people. Without fault, every single person who'd been in elite sports said, I've seen this as well. Every single one of them. I've sent it to people all over the world, and everyone said to me, "Yeah, we see that all the time." It doesn't surprise me. It's cool that it's published. What that says to me is that this is probably the elite athlete curve. Probably looks different to everybody else's curve, or the curve is the same for all humans, but the curve that we have is representative of only recreationals or avid amateurs or sub elites, not the truly elite people, right? And again, what separates elites is probably their ability to both do work and recover from it. So
Okay, and
then
that's yeah. Go ahead.
I
Sorry.
was going to say, and then it's back to that question of is that innate or developed or both, right?
Yeah. And that's the transformation of energy. Probably the first thing that I told you that I remember when you sent that paper to me. I'm sure it was something like, "These guys are avoiding a lot of data here." I mean,
Yeah,
for sure
yeah,
they
yeah,
they can publish much more, but they don't want to publish because that paper I think is fantastic to have. The same as Killian is publishing now data on his energy expenditure, having data of Christian Blumenfeld, and is very, very insightful for everyone. But I'm
yep.
sure Olaf himself, they are still keeping a lot of data with them.
Oh no, he's
And
told me that. He's
and
told me they
yeah.
have a series of
Oh, okay.
articles.
So that is
He's
yeah.
told me that he's told me we are keeping this, and there's a series of papers coming.
Oh,
That's
okay, great. Well,
that's the hope. Well, whether that comes, because as you say, right, and this is the other uncomfortable truth: just because you have a paper and just because it's written doesn't mean it gets published,
yeah,
right?
correct. That's another one. Yeah, exactly,
So
exactly. But anyway,
there's
so yeah, I mean, that's probably the first reaction. Like we are also seeing that, and then there is a lot of common knowledge in for example, in high elite cycling world
yep.
that is never going to be published, and the science doesn't explain it. So it is. Well, that is kind of something that we also need to understand. But coming back to your question, yeah, of course, the best athlete in the world. Let's go to cycling. Tadej Pogacar. He's a winner of Tour de France, 4 times, if I'm not wrong. He's got bigger capacity to transform energy than the second one, than Jonas Vingegaard. Okay, and that means that doesn't mean that the winner is the one who transforms more energy. Not necessarily that, but he's got more energy available to use it in adaptation, in recovery, in dealing with resistances from the human biology. That might be a sickness or an illness or a stress or whatever. Tadej Pogacar, probably he can flow his energy through the body in a better way than the second one, and Killing Your Net compared to the second one, and myself compared with my cousin that I'm better than him on the road. So at the end of the day, that energy transformation, which is not necessarily only a matter of a strength power, like, yeah, I can spend more energy, more kilocalories. It's not only that. I've got more resources to cope with the daily kind of resistances of the life, or the training process, for example. Okay, and that's the difference between a winner and someone who just barely finishes the race, for example. Of course, and answering your question straight, of course that depends highly on your talent and your genetics. And I like this concept of, if you want to win the tour, first you have to choose your parents very
Yeah, choose your
wisely,
parents well. Yeah, yeah,
because you're never gonna win the tour if you don't have that check, and
yeah,
you are probably one of the best on that kind of genetical profile, or genetic, sorry, profile. But then, of course, there is a very limited amount of, or there's a very limited piece, or small piece, on the whole cake. So, because we cannot change that, and of course, don't get me wrong, because we continuously change the genetic code, and that is called, of course, epigenetic. But all the rest of what we do, how we train, how we manage that, and nutrition, etc., of course, it has probably more weight than your talent. But the difference at the highest level is that Pogacar and Vingegaard, they know very well how to train, they know very well how to eat, and of course, different elements of using this or that can be representative of the performance, or can be determinant. But at that level, probably the talent and the genetic is probably the most determinant thing, because everybody is doing everything really, really, really well, and everybody is optimizing all the elements into the maximum capacity of optimization.
yeah. I talk about this a lot. There's this, sports generally go through this standard sort of pattern where initially it's very amateur, talent wins. Then systems come into it. Things become more codified and systematized and methodical and
Mhm.
scientific. Then systems win for a period of time. And then as things progress further, everyone starts doing that. Then talent wins again. Then it's talent and systems, right? So talent or genetics may be 5% or 10% of the total pie. But if the rest of the pie is exactly the same, that 5 or 10% makes a difference, right? So that's kind
Exactly.
of how the
I
systems.
read recently. I read something around. I think, yeah, number around 7% or 8% of that was the weight of genetic into the lifespan. So how long will live.
Yeah.
It is genetics are only counting for that kind of 7 or 8%. I don't know where I read this, and I think it's quite insightful to understand that not necessarily only on high performance, but also on a kind of health
Yeah, of course.
level, or just normal lifestyle. It is very, very important to have that very clear in our minds, that we can impact on the 93% of the whole cake.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about life. I know you've got some doubly labeled water from your own experience
Yeah.
on
Yeah.
yourself. I think this insight's one of the most enjoyable I've had from one of our conversations. Can you share this info about what you learned from your own doubly labeled water experiment on yourself?
Yeah, well, you learn that in training, in a training process, sometimes the training time is the least important factor in your daily, energy expenditure. And yeah, I've seen things like, I've basically, because I'm someone who works and not trains, but does kind of a physical exercise just to decompress a little bit my body and my mind. I have seen, how that impact changes completely the energy transformation, or that final number of the day. So many, I have tried different periods of my kind of work, or when I have been more stressed, less stress, and you see the impact of that stress on the energy expenditure, on that final number, is huge. I mean, sometimes I've been training very little, and my energy expenditure has gone to the roof, and the other way around. Meaning that, not necessarily your training pattern, if I'm running today 5 hours, um, is going to be representative of how much energy I'm transforming over a week. And that's the funny thing, is that sometimes we have seen this, or I have seen this, almost not training on that week, but being super stressed or even sick, and that energy expenditure goes to the roof. The body doesn't know if I'm training or not. The body knows that I am exploring the limits of my capacity to transform energy. So if you are an athlete and if you are sick and you are allocating a lot of energy to that part of your human body, which is healing or fighting against a pathogens or a sickness or whatever, then you can understand that you have very little energy left to allocate to the training. And that's the learning that I have experienced for myself, that sometimes, I was spending more energy without moving at all than when I was training on a regular basis, whatever, like 7 hours per week. And that's pretty cool. I mean, you really weight the impact of dealing with stress or being sick or being anxious of something because you have a problem on your work or whatever. And that's why I talk about this concept that you're measuring everything, but everything is part of your capacity to give resistance to your flow of energy, because we are a material that basically we have to be in relation with that energy. And if that relationship is wrong simply because I'm not capable of finding that flow, then you get sick or you over exceed your energy budget or other conditions.
Yeah, I think this aligns with so many insights we have, right? So one of them is, everyone talks about stress, and the body doesn't understand the source. Just there is stress, or this concept of allostatic load, right? And I've written about it. People talk about it a lot. Is like it's just total load on the body. Now we could look at that as we could quantify that arbitrarily as load, or we could look at it from an energy standpoint, an expenditure standpoint. So, I mean, you see this though, and people understand this. They say, oh, he's had a crash in the Tour de France. He's going to struggle because he's got to recover from that, right? Healing costs something, right? And it does. This is also why we recently had Marco Altini on the podcast. I know you know Marco quite
Oh yeah.
well. And Marco, talked about HRV guided training. And, when our HRV is low, doing less and doing less total work, we end up recovering better. Why? Because it's not about training more. It's about training appropriately, dosing and recovering from that and coming back stronger. So if we're not ready to deal with that load because we're sick or stressed or whatever else, then it's a problem, right? And that's the biggest difference between, let's use triathlon, because I think triathlon is probably the sport where non-pros and pros are closest to each other, right? Maybe not Christian Blumenfeld's close to a new pro, but like the top end age grouper is very close to pro in some contexts, right? And in that context, what you will find is that the top end age grouper, the difference between them and a pro is not training hours. It's everything else, right? It's other load that they have to deal with. And this is why, back to our last episode with you, when you're designing a performance environment, things like logistics become a variable that you want to look after because you want to give people energy and time and stuff back, right? They can sleep more, they can do whatever else more. So I think it's a nice bow that we tie on this to finish up, is that like for people listening now, this isn't about Christian Blumenfeld doing however many times like their PAL or Kylian Jornet running 10 PAL at Western States. This is about you and your training and your day and how you show up at work and for family, and all that stuff costs energy, right? So where are you going to spend your energy budget?
Exactly. And even me, I mean, everybody expects number and a recipe and a solution. Honestly, we don't have it. I mean, right now with this concept, we don't have it. But I think it can serve as a way of thinking, that when you are talking or when you're thinking about your energy as a finite resource, and that is not your energy, and I want to make this distinction really, really well. This is not your energy availability. This is your capacity to transform energy. Sorry, I'm gonna spend a minute
No, no,
explaining this, but
this is good. Yeah.
if energy budget could be something related to your energy availability, people with obesity, they could be the best
Yep.
transforming energy, okay, because they have more energy availability on their body.
Yep.
But that's not the case. The energy budget, or the amount of energy that you can transform over a day or a certain period of time, depends on your capacity to transform it. So your mitochondrial function. Okay, so again, coming back to the point, as an idea, if you understand that you are limited on that, same as the money, I can spend, 10 euros per day. Of course, today I can spend 12, and tomorrow I can spend 14. But what is going to happen on the third day? That I'm going to have a debt, and I have to face that debt. This is exactly the same in the energy kind of budget thing. And again, we don't have numbers, recipes, equations. I'm sorry, we're not there yet. We definitely we're not there. We can be with some athletes where we have been measuring, 10 different points across the season or whatever. But and any one of us, we are not going to arrive there because this technique is super expensive. Because we still need a lot of we still need to walk the walk a little bit more. But as a concept, if you start thinking as you've got a certain energy, a finite energy per day, I am sure, 100% sure that you're going to make better decisions. Because if today you are stressed for whatever reason, and let's say you have a very important meeting and you are just getting ready for that meeting on your work or whatever, you have an exam, as a student, and you are spending a lot of time and effort and of course transforming a lot of energy to study and get ready for that exam. If you understand that that means that you're spending part of your budget, you're going to make the right decision that day because you're going to train accordingly to that expenditure. Okay, so that is as a concept. I'm always talking as a kind of hypothetical concept. If you understand that, I am 100% sure that you're going to start making good decisions on your energy allocation on a daily routine.
Yeah, people will probably stop spending so much time arguing on social media. That's for sure, and not
For
spending that
example,
energy. Yeah, it's a
exactly.
good example. And I mean, listen, there's good research on injury rates during exam periods in students. Right, that's a good example of hey, they don't have the capacity to recover, therefore they get injured. Right, that's one example there. So no, that's been really good. I think there's a lot for people to think about here. Remembering again, like as you say, it's about energy transformation, and that's not just do I eat more, because you have to absorb that and then get it to your mitochondria and then you transform that into energy. So it is about the end product there, and we don't. It's a black box at the moment. We have no idea. We can measure maybe expenditure and maybe an idea of input, but we have no idea of exactly what you're absorbing there. Sorry, you're going to say something, Aitor?
Yeah. Let me say something just to also to reinforce this point.
Yep.
One of the most serious papers on this topic. The title is not energy expenditure on the human body, whatever. Is alimentary limit on the human body. And why is that? Because how much you can eat, and not only eat, but all those things that are part of eating, meaning absorbing, digesting, absorbing, and oxidizing or transforming that energy, it highly depends on your capacity to transform energy. So the reason why Christian Blumenfeld can continuously eat whatever 8,000 calories per day, it is because his capacity to use that substrate, those that fuel of energy, that amount of energy, is equal to those 8,000 or more. So that is a very important concept. Depending on how you can use those resources, then you can ask for them. But it's not the other way around. It's not like, yeah, I'm going to start eating and then I'm going to increase my capacity to transform energy. And that's, I think if anyone is thinking around nutrition on this concept, I think, that serves as a universal law. I mean, nutrition is about understanding the rules of metabolism. And then if you understand that, Killian Jornet can eat up to X amount of thousands of calories, but my friend John, he cannot, simply because he's not capable of spending that energy or transforming that energy. Then I think from nutrition point of view, you understand almost everything.
Yeah, I think it's a great way to end the podcast there. This has been great. I mean, we do speak for hours, so it's unsurprising that this
Yeah.
hour flew by. So I really appreciate you. Listeners are going to keep hearing from you. So please, if they're enjoying it, please let us know. We're going to have a couple more episodes in this series. We're going to touch on some things like lactate, ketones. We're going to talk about carbohydrates. So they're all coming, all part of this energy expenditure series. So thanks again for joining us today, Aitor. And we've got links to all of your sort of everything to find you, social media, etc. is all in our show notes, as is a link to our previous episode with you, which I think is a good place. If you haven't listened to that, go back and listen to it. I'm hoping you listened to it before this, but otherwise, we'll talk to you next time, Aitor. Thank you so much.
That was a pleasure. Thank you, David.